the Apostle John tells us this particular event in Jesus' life in this 4th chapter of his gospel there. And the text indicates that it was getting on towards fall. Seems to be, at least. I would suspect the evenings were getting increasingly cool, and perhaps the leaves beginning to display their brilliance, and perhaps the squirrels and animals at that time gathering up the acorns or whatever nuts they had at that time for the winter. And the birds starting to head south, although I don't really know if the birds in that area go south or north or wherever they go, but if they go somewhere, it was that time of the and so on. And for Jesus, this fall season had come or was soon to approach. And he had come to Samaria, which is a little unusual. But the reason he did that is because he'd been teaching and preaching in the area of Judea, which is south of Samaria, and he was going to be heading up to Galilee, which is north of Samaria, and the most direct route was to go through, which is what he did. And so the road, I suspect, was quite dusty. I suspect that the temperature was up and a little bit warm there, and so on. Probably high noon, Jesus is thirsty. And so he pauses for a bit, we're told, at the city of Sychar, where there was a well, Jacob's well, at that particular area. I'm sure he was hoping for a drink of water, but he didn't have anything with which to draw the water out from the well. And so he sees a woman of the village approaching. And I'm sure he thought, this is my chance to get a drink of water. And he asks her and so forth. Well, I'm sure you know the rest of that account pretty well. I'm not going to stay on that one for quite a little while at all. But I want to go to the end, more towards the end of that chapter that John wrote in that 4th chapter, way down to the 35th verse. And so today I'd like to have you think with me on 2 statements that Jesus makes at that time. I think he makes 2 rather striking observations at that time when he then observes the disciples who had now come and joined him, and he's probably sitting on a bit of a rise in the area there and overlooking the fields and so forth. And he says to them 2 things. The first thing he says, do you not say there are yet 4 months and then comes the harvest? Which is probably what a lot of them did. And then he says the next thing right following that, he says, behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that they are white for harvest. Now what I'd like to do this morning is to take those 2 statements and share some thoughts with you on evangelism. Now, you know some things are scary, sort of scary at least. And I suspect you've noticed that. I'm sure you have. I must tell you a little story about one of my granddaughters. Her name was Brooke. Actually, this was when she was about 7 years old. Brooke is now a registered nurse working up in Fargo. But at that time, Darlene and I were visiting with the Carlson family, and Brooke was there, and she said to us that she had stopped reading a book. She said the book was just way too scary. She wasn't going to read that book anymore. Because she said she had read that the little girl in the story had glued her eyes to the door. And she said, that was just too scary to think about. Why would anyone want to glue their eyes to the door? Well, when we explained the intended meaning of that statement, then she understood a little better and agreed with us, well, maybe the book isn't quite as scary as she thought it was. But you know what? There are some scary things in life. There really are. And my hunch that for some, perhaps many of us in this room, the idea of evangelism is kind of scary. Or if not scary, it makes us a little uncomfortable. And I want to talk about that this morning, and I hope I'll be able to help you see that the idea is not at all as scary as we may have felt after all. And just as with the dissipation of Brooke's fear, I think that when we know the facts and the truth of the statement and the concept, that our initial fears will fade away. Now, before you decide that this message on evangelism is not for you, and some of you may already draw that conclusion, and you want to immediately tune me out, well, give me a few minutes to share some, in my case, some very personal thoughts with you on the subjects, things that you may have never considered before. And if you'll do that, we can make a deal. That seems like a fair thing. Okay, let's make a deal. All right. You know, the single certain thing that can be said about harvest time, it seems to me, is that the harvest can't wait. Many times, just even a couple of weeks ago, when I was driving through northern Iowa, for example, southern Minnesota, there were headlights in the field, men and women working long after dark. They're getting in the harvest. The corn is ripe, the beans are dry, the fields are ready for harvest, and the harvest can't wait. The harvest has to be done, and you know that, and so do I. But I'm going to take a chance here and say, I think I have a better idea of that than you do. Now, I've got to explain myself before I get into any trouble there. Because as many as true of you as was of me, I come from my roots are in agriculture. My grandfather and my father's farm was purchased back in 1898. And our farm was far different from some of the big fields down in Iowa and down in this area and so on and so forth. We were truck farmers. And if you don't know what a truck farmer is a person that raises vegetables. And while some of the folks here might have only 2 or 3 crops in the fields, corn and beans and a few other things like that and so forth, let me tell you the crops that we had in the fields. I don't think I've got them all listed here, but they included at least these. We were truck farmers. Our crops were vegetables like tomatoes and peppers and spinach and cucumbers and squash and dill and cabbage and cauliflower and onions and carrots and beets and radishes and lettuce and parsley and strawberries and melons and asparagus and green and wax beans and eggplant and raspberries, pickles and broccoli and even mustard greens. We did. We had all of those in the fields. And you know, the point is, as the fall season approached, we had to be kind of careful about that, get those things in. I can still vividly see my grandfather anxiously reading the weather report, specifically to determine if we might have a frost that night. And I can still see him not only read the weather report, but gauge the strength of the wind. And he would look at the density of the cloud cover, you see, and note particularly the stage of the moon. True. And if there was little or no wind, and if there was a clear sky, and if the moon was full, the temperature was sure to fall, and we would have a killing frost before morning. Now, that may seem a little strange to some, but I want to tell you that it worked pretty good. It was really something that did happen. And then, unless it was Sunday, when we did no work, everybody was into the fields. Men, women, boys, and girls. Pick everything you can. Pack it away in the barn. Because by tomorrow morning, the fields would no longer be white for harvest, or ready for harvest. They would be white with frost. And so the time of harvest would be over and past. What had not been harvested that previous day would never be harvested at all. Those were stressful days. I remember them very well. But you know what? That was in the fall of the year. But harvesting for us was not a one-time event, not a one-time-in-the-year event. We had to harvest things when the crops were ready to be harvested. You didn't wait. You didn't wait until the cabbage had split wide open. You couldn't sell them if they were split. You didn't wait until the lettuce bolted up into big seed stalks, or other things did that sort of like that too. Or the kohlrabi's turned to wood inside. If you're trying to bite a kohlrabi afterwards, well, you know, you can't get through them. You had to do it when the crops were ready to be harvested, whenever that was. And of course, there was always, when the cucumbers got big and fat and yellow and so on, they weren't much good either. And the tomatoes, when they got overripe, they got really soft and mushy. Well, they were great for tomato fights, of which I was often admittedly a skilled participant, but it weren't much else. So you had to get the crop in when it was ready. And I think the account there is important for us to remember, because the harvest depends on the readiness of the crop. Not on the page of the calendar, not on the force of the wind, not on the cloud cover, or even the phase of the moon, and sometimes at the beginning of summer, there may seem to be no urgency for harvest. Why worry? It's only June. We still have time. We have several months. And to some extent, that is true, or may be true to a degree in an agricultural sense. I would accept that. But to some extent, we have to go a little further. You know, as well as I do, that when Jesus made these statements, he was not talking about bringing in the corn or the cabbage. He was not talking about bringing in the barley or the beans. He was not talking about bringing in the oats or the onions. He was talking about people. He was talking about people. And when he looked across the fields, he said, the harvest is truly plentiful, but, where are the people? So, the workers are few, he would say. And he knew full well that with people, as well as with vegetables, when harvest time was past, when life ends, there will be no further harvest of people to eternal life. And Jesus saw that as critical. It seems reasonable to me that we see it similarly so. Now, I suspect someone might ask a reasonable question as well. And that might be something like, well, are the fields really white to harvest? Is it that serious and so forth? Aren't most folks already Christians? Is the observation of Jesus still valid today? Or have we not gleaned those fields pretty adequately? And so everybody's a Christian these days. Well, not so sure. George Barna, for example, states that 2/3 of all Americans receive Christ as Lord and Savior before they reach 18, which suggests to me that the time of harvest for those individuals is prior to the time they get to be 18. Because most of the people, 2/3, 66% of the people accept Christ at that time. There continues to be a consistent degree of attrition or falling away from the Christian faith, with a number of men particularly having an active faith continuing to decline. We're told that only half of all self-described Christians consider themselves absolutely committed. Others are kind of so-so, I suppose. And the number of unchurched adults, people who have no relationship with the church at all, in the United States continues to increase, doubling over the past 10 years. These are people that have no association with the church. Far worse in Canada, and a disaster in Europe, where perhaps only maybe 4 or 5% of the people attend church on a regular basis. 4 or 5%. We are told that only about 30% of young folks continue to attend church after leaving their parents' homes. And Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for Faith, observes that 2/3 of all Americans deny that there is any such thing as truth. It means that only one person out of every 3 that you meet on the street would believe in truth. That's kind of interesting, too. And then Evangelist Charles Templeton, I found this kind of interesting, states that 4 out of every 5 persons on the face of the earth, that's 80% of the people on the face of the earth, believe in gods other than the Christian God, and that over the 5 billion people that we have on earth these days worship 3,000 gods, 3,000 different gods, including some of the animists and the tribal gods and so forth. The number of Americans who state that they are atheists has risen from about 1% up to about 5%, which doesn't seem too large, but it's a 5 times increase over a period of time. The total number of those who claim no religious affiliation now stands at 19%, which is 20%, 1 out of every 5. And those who consider themselves as religious now make up 60% of the population, which interestingly enough is down from 73% just 7 years ago. You can see the trend lines. They're going down. They're going down. And so Jesus' words, I think, are applicable. American Christianity leans heavily towards the superficial. Many people have little or no comprehensive Bible knowledge, and many are likely to make decisions based on what they read or see in the media, as they are to look into the Word of God. Maybe even more so. And I think you would agree with me that if Jesus were here with us today and observe our nation and the nations of the world, our society in general. I don't know. I think he would forcefully repeat the statement he made way back then. Behold, I say, lift up your eyes and look on the fields. They're white to harvest. It's waiting for us to come out and help. So quite clearly it seems to me we're expected to be harvesters or evangelists. Now, having said that, to many people, that's a bit of a scary idea. That's something threatening to them, at least a subject they would not always like to discuss, and an activity in which they would prefer not to participate. But again, before you turn me off on that a little bit, and I can understand where you're coming from there and so on, let me ask you to consider a couple of questions. The first is, how exactly does one do evangelism? Is there only one way? And that's the second question. Well, I think there are many ways, and I'd like to suggest a few examples to you this morning from my own personal experiences. Being personal experiences, I know they're true, because I was there. I've done that. It was part of me. Let me tell you first of all about my great-grandfather. My daughter Mary is a genealogist, and she's done lots of digging and so forth in the history of our family and so on. And some of the things that she's found are not really very good, but some of them are okay. But my great-grandfather lived in Germany, of course, the Ruhr Valley there, was, as best can be said about him, a drunkard, probably an alcoholic, often beating up his children. My grandfather's mother, my great-grandfather's wife, died when my grandfather was only 2 years old, and my great-grandfather married again, and his second wife joined him in beating up the children. That's my background, you see. He was so severe in his activity, in his beating up of the family members, that finally my grandfather and his brother, what were they, married about 14 or 15 years old or something like that, they wrapped up what they had in a little handkerchief, took it on their back, got on a boat. How they did that, I don't know. They got on a boat and came over to this country. 14 or 15 years old, that's all. And my grandfather settled in Minnesota, and his brother settled in Wisconsin. If you'd ask me why, I'd say, I don't know. They just did it. And in 1898, my grandfather purchased a farm in the area where there happened to be several Baptist Christian families. And through caring for one another in sickness and in death, and in those days there was plenty of that, and in planting and harvest, and the quiet testimony and witness of these families influenced my grandparents to become Baptist Christians. I've known many of those families myself for many years. They still live in the same area. Now, they may not have called it evangelism at that time, but it was. It was just simply living with your neighbors and trying to bring them into a fellowship that you had. They were evangelists. I should tell you something also about my grandfather more personally. Without a doubt, the hardest working and the most honest person that I've ever known. I grew up during the Depression years of the 1930s, as did some of you, I suppose. And those were tough years. Our whole family of six, my mother, father, and the four of us children, we had to move in with our grandparents in the middle 30s because we couldn't make ends meet. And then when I was 14, my mother died, and so I was kind of an orphan and so forth at that time too. And there were always about 9 of us around the table, sometimes 10 or 11 during the summer when we had a hired man or two. And I always sat right next to my grandfather, all the time. I don't know if they put me there because I misbehaved once in a while, or I don't know. I never asked. I didn't think it was worthwhile to ask. And so here was my grandfather right here, and here was me, and we sat right there, bing, bing. And he would pray before every single meeting, every single meal. Now, and he'd always pray in the German language, of course, you need to know that. At noon, his prayer was very short because I suppose we got to get back out in the fields and get to work. It was just a verse of Scripture. It was always the same verse of Scripture. Let me quote it for you. Danke dem Herrn, denn ist to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. That was his noon prayer. Every single noon. I don't think he missed a one. But morning and evening, his prayers, again in German, were long, and he never failed to pray for God's mercy and care over us, his children and grandchildren. And that phrase was much shorter. The phrase that he used was, Barme über unser Kinder. Barme über unser Kinder. Protect them. Keep them in your care. That type of thing. It's very sometimes difficult to translate one language to another language absolutely identical. But that was the intent of it. Keep all these children in your care. Because he came from the family where he got beat up every day. Well, that's about 75 years ago. That's 3/4 of a century. But I remember those words as well as I remember my own name. And I think I can honestly say that I speak those words either in English, more frequently in German, when I pray for our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren today. Barme über unser Kinder. If I were to go to my grandfather and I say, Grandpa, do you know you're an evangelist? He would look at me and say, oh, shucks. He wouldn't believe a word I said. But he was. He was. He really was. In that particular little niche, he was, you see. And the influence is very, very long-lasting. It would have taken him completely by surprise, but indeed, he was an evangelist. Can you imagine it? Then I also think of my father. Not very well educated at all. That opportunity didn't present itself at that time. But he was gifted as a Sunday school teacher for many, many years. He was always teaching, always taught the junior boys. That group of kids that's so exuberant with all their antics, it drives most of us nuts. That's the way they are. Well, let's face it. But he was able to deal with them. And he did. His favorite words of Scripture were Jesus' words to Peter, when Jesus said to Peter, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. Those were his words. Now, I doubt that anybody, or that he ever thought of himself as an evangelist. I just don't think he ever did that. But in that little niche of ministry, in that little cubbyhole of ministry, if you will, that's indeed what he surely was. And I can tell you that many of the boys that he tolerated and taught, now long since grown to manhood, are striking evidence of that. And they have personally told me so. So this isn't just my speculation. And so I think also of my Sunday school teacher when I was in my teens. And I'm rather embarrassed to tell you that he's the only Sunday school teacher that I can remember. I suspect I could have remembered a few years ago, but they're not there anymore. But his name, which probably doesn't mean much to you at all, but his name was Henry Marks. And he was a prominent St. Paul attorney. And he had some political aspirations to run for a state senate seat at one time. But you know what? His friends discouraged him. They said to him, Henry, they said, you'll never be elected. You're too honest. Well, things have changed, isn't that something? But he's right. He probably never would have been elected in that fashion. But here was a fellow who through the week might well have been pleading a case in district court. But on Sunday morning, he was just as diligently involved in teaching a Sunday school class of half a dozen teenage boys in a tiny makeshift converted storage room, and occasionally taking those boys out on a camping trip, something like that, And those experiences have remained with me all these years, yes, and including the soggy eggs and bacon cooked over a campfire in the rain. But I'll tell you what, he was an evangelist. He was an evangelist. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure he was an evangelist without his ever realizing that he was, or the eternal influence that he had, his efforts had on all of us boys. Well, I also tell you about my pastor during my teens, the Reverend John Wobig, the pastor. He was a good pastor. And those, again, as I mentioned earlier, were Depression years. We did a lot of strange things just to make ends meet during those years. And I suspect some of you may have done the same. Somehow my father had obtained several tons, I did say tons, several loads, truckloads, of surplus potatoes made unfit for human consumption. But interestingly enough, okay to feed to the cows. Now, how they did that, I don't know. But it turned out to be my job, I guess to chop them up into bits and pieces so that the cows wouldn't choke on them, I suppose. And so here I am, sitting in one of our sheds, chopping up these potatoes, and the most miserable job you can imagine. And my pastor came and called on me and asked me to make a public profession of my faith by stepping into the waters of baptism. Now really, be honest with me now. Would you have ever contrived such a setting for an evangelistic outreach? I doubt it had ever happened before. I feel sure that it will not happen again. But at that moment, that's just what it was. I said yes. I said yes. And you might be interested, I don't know if you'd be interested in it or knowing or not, but I've now been a member of the Riverview Baptist Church for 74 years, presently the person of the longest membership of all living persons. I don't know if that makes any I don't know if that's impressive or not, but it's kind of funny. But I need also to tell you a little bit more. This is about my mother. She died 72 years ago. Remember when I told you I was just 14 at the time, which I was the oldest of my siblings. And I vividly recall once when I suppose I was, 8 or 9, that area, feeling very sorry for myself. I was lying on my bed, I was kind of weepy. And my mother came by and asked what was troubling me. And I recall saying something like, oh, I don't know, I try, but I can't seem to be good, and this type of thing, And sensing my need for forgiveness of sin, a need I myself didn't even realize that I had, she immediately dropped to her knees at my bedside and prayed for my salvation. Now, folks, that's 80 years ago. 80 years ago. And I'll never forget it. It's a precious memory. It's the kind of a memory that I categorize as being on holy ground. Now, I don't know if anyone ever called her an evangelist, although I think that she was. But at that very moment, the very fact that I stand here before you today, I think proves that indeed she was. In my mind, all of these folks were evangelists, persons who at that unique point in time were doing the work of an evangelist, even though they were not aware of it. Even today, there are those who by their words, their quiet influence, continue to strengthen my Christian faith, and perhaps yours too, because they too are evangelists or disciple makers. Okay, so where am I going with this? Well, Paul, in his letter to the Ephesian Christians, wrote this. He said, and he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers. So I think clearly some Christians are called and gifted to be evangelists in the full sense of that term as we know it. The Billy Grahams, for example. I don't think there's any question about the fact that Billy Graham is called to be an evangelist, and he is. But Paul says some, not all. May I conclude then that not all are called and gifted to be evangelists evangelist in the fullest sense of the word. I think that's okay. Perhaps few of us here in this room today have the honor and the privilege of being so called and so ordained by God. But wait a minute. Paul wrote other things too. And in his letter to Timothy, he wrote something else about evangelism like this. He says, "But you," Paul says to Timothy, "be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry." Okay, so what does it mean to do the work of an evangelist? Well, my pastor has often stated that every Christian has been given at least one gift for ministry, and many others have more than one. And I believe that's true. I believe that's our responsibility, therefore, to use that gift that we've been given, or those gifts, if we can put them in the plural, that we have been given. And in so doing, in that manner, in some manner, we'll be doing the work of an evangelist, exercising the gifts given to us in ministry. And I further believe that fulfillment of ministry will be just as effective as the most powerful ministry of the greatest evangelist who ever walked across the platform of a church or an auditorium or whatever. And I'll tell you what, doing the work of an evangelist takes many forms. I don't know what it's like here, but generally speaking, wherever it's like keeping the building neat and clean, the grass mowed, the sidewalk shoveled, the flowers blooming in their beds, teaching youngsters, leading youth groups, singing in the praise team, performing on the instruments, a kind word to an individual, serving in church leadership positions, ushering, greeting, encouraging, offering hospitality, visiting the sick, witnessing in the community, assisting the needy, praying, just plain helping, and the list goes on and on and on. You can't stop it. Because doing the work of an evangelist does not have an end. It has a beginning, and then you keep on going. No, we may not have been given the specific gift of evangelism, but every one of us, I think, is responsible for using that or those gifts given to us, whatever they may be, to do the work of an evangelist. I have always appreciated the words of St. Francis of Assisi many, many years ago. Maybe you're familiar with them as well. He said this: "Preach every chance you get. Use words if you have to." Pretty good advice, eh? Pretty good advice. He's saying the same thing I did. I believe that God fully intends for us to use those gifts that He's placed within us, to do that unique work of evangelism for which He has equipped us. I believe that's what Paul meant when he wrote to Timothy and to us. I don't know about you, but I'm convinced that I'm able to stand before you today because many people in many walks of life over the years significantly impacted my life by faithfully exercising their individual gifts, by doing the work of an evangelist. Including, and if you didn't hear me for what I've said just before, listen to me now, including the folks of this very church, the folks of this church, and in 1983 or 1984, about 80 years ago, provided housing in the church parsonage. For what? For a little 6-year-old girl and her mother. Homeless people. Grieving the deaths of their other 4 members of their family. And that little girl becoming the mother of you guessed it, our 6 children, our 17 grandchildren. So far, 5 great-grandchildren, and I'm sure there are more to come. You know, to me, that's a concrete example of doing the work of an evangelist. And I'm not a gambler, so when I say I bet, it's not because I bet, it's just a word of faith. I bet that there wasn't a person in that church, and these are some of your fathers and your mother and your grandparents. I don't believe any one of them ever thought that was doing the work of an evangelist. But it was. It really was. It really How about you and I? Will we impact? What yet impact will we have in our remaining lives? Will it be said of us that we might not even have realized he or she was faithful in doing the work of the evangelist? So, what can you do personally in that broad area of evangelism? Well, you know the answer to that better than I do. Just exercise a gift or gifts that God has given you because there is something you can do. Perhaps far better than any other person in this room. Just imagine, you and I have the power, and in fact are significantly responsible in some way to become a participant in the extension of God's grace. Instrumental in bringing life eternal to someone. Does the name Madeline Murray O'Hare ring a bell with any of you? She's long since gone now. One of the great atheists of all time. The late great atheist. I read something very sobering concerning her recently. I don't know if you ever read this or not. She had apparently kept a diary of her daily life. And she had repeatedly, not just occasionally, but repeatedly written in that diary. This is Madeline Murray O'Hare, the atheist, had repeatedly written in her diary, somebody, somewhere, love me. I wonder, don't you wonder, what might have happened had someone responded? And I don't know how they would have responded. That's not my problem. How they would have responded. In some loving kindness, approached her without ever realizing that he or she was doing the work of the evangelist, but it would have been. Then the second question is this. Aren't you glad that somebody responded to you in the same way? Because they did. Yeah. And somehow, somebody cared enough to bring you into the very presence of the loving God of the universe. Aren't you glad? So am I. So am I. Do I have time to take one more illustration?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to take it. You may know that Arlene, almost 50 years ago, 54 years, died about 8 years ago. We celebrated our 62nd wedding anniversary last month, and she kept an occasional journal which she called Walk With Me. And I'd like to read something she wrote in that journal that was also read by one of our children at her memorial service. And she entitled this little short essay, Walk With Me in the New Year. And this is what she wrote. This, she says it's 12:10 a.m., beginning of a new year. I just finished my prayers, reminisce. Our first New Year's Eve together as a young married couple. How will we celebrate? Church tradition was to have a New Year's Eve service at Riverview Baptist Church. We went. Little did I know what an impact that service would have on me. It started with the fellowship supper, ended at midnight when the bells and the horns rang out. We had a fun time all evening, lots of fellowship, and the final thing was going back into the sanctuary for prayer. We prayed over into the new year. I very much liked the idea of praying as the old year was put behind us and the clean new year began. And so every year thereafter, I treasured that tradition. When we started a family, I would take the little ones home after the supper so they could get to bed at their usual time. And Father stayed at church. I always waited for him to come home. 5 or 10 minutes before midnight, I started my rounds, going to each child, saying a prayer over each little sleeping angel, and placed a quiet kiss on their foreheads. For me, there was no better way to start the new year. It gave me a feeling of peace and love between my Lord and our family. Time flies. This is year number 45. Our 6 children have all grown up now, left the nest. I still carry on the New Year's Eve tradition, midnight tradition, even though I can only picture them here as I pray. 17 grandchildren have been added to my prayer. I feel sure the Lord will be waiting for our traditional visit again next New Year's Eve and every New Year's Eve after that, even through all eternity. I don't think it'd be a surprise to you for me to make the statement that I am totally convinced that Darlene was doing the work of an evangelist. And there's not one shred of doubt in my mind that all she did over those many years contributed significantly to the names of all of our children, as well as those of our grandchildren, indelibly inscribed, even now, in the Lamb's Book of Life. Our circle is unbroken. But there's more. As I said, that essay was read at Darlene's memorial service. I was told that following that service, 2 of her cousins went to their pastors and requested believers' baptism. And yet there's more. On June 28th, exactly 10 months to the day following the date of Darlene's death, one of those cousins also died at age 61. Just imagine doing the work of an evangelist even after death, and just 10 months before it was too late. I started out by asking the question, is there only one way to do evangelism? I don't think so. And I'm glad that that's true, because we're all different people. It's simply using the gifts, the opportunities God has uniquely given to each of us. Maybe it's teaching a Sunday school class, I don't know. Visiting the sick, accepting leadership responsibility, being a witness to a neighbor, helping needy, oh, and on and on and on. Maybe it's just a simple prayer. Maybe it's just a gentle kiss on the forehead of a little sleeping angel. No matter how old that angel may be. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the ongoing testimony of our lives as we are remembered and even as we lie at rest in our memorial service. How about that? You may want to think.